This is Cinema Field Guide, a podcast that surveys the breadth and depth of film history, one movement or micro-genre at a time. I'm Brian.
Felicia.
Today we are talking about Aguirre, The Wrath of God, the 1972 film by Werner Herzog. So we're going to cover a lot of aspects of this movie, but we will start here with a brief synopsis. Felicia, would you like to do the honors of reading us this little synopsis of the movie?
For sure, I will. So, Aguirre, Wrath of God. A few decades after the destruction of the Inca Empire, a Spanish expedition led by the infamous Aguirre leaves the mountains of Peru and goes down the Amazon River in search of the lost city of El Dorado. When great difficulties arise, Aguirre's men start to wonder whether their quest will lead them to prosperity or certain death.
Yes.
Pretty intense.
It is pretty intense, and from the very beginning of the film, it's pretty intense, but it does somehow manage to progress over the course of the film in an interesting way as well. So we will get into the details of the film, what we liked, what we didn't like, but first we're going to give some background to the movie. So, of course, directed by Werner Herzog, perhaps the most famous of the new German cinema directors. This is his third narrative feature film, so very early in his career, and really the first one that's talked about as one of his great films or classics. Those first two aren't talked about as much. I haven't seen either of them. I don't know if you checked either of those out, Felicia, but
I haven't seen them yet. I've heard interesting things about the second one from friends who've seen it. They were like, that was a lot. But I am curious to see them. And I to be honest, it wasn't until again doing this that I realized how early Aguirre was in his career. I did think it was a little bit later, closer to Fitzcarraldo, which is 10 years later.
Yeah, it is sort of wild that they return after a longer period. It'd make more sense if they were back-to-back, though I'm not sure that anybody would have survived back-to-back productions like that. So, Werner Herzog, could you talk us through a little bit of his style and persona, Felicia?
Well, persona, to say the very least, because as you said, he's probably the most famous overall from the movement, especially because his career has evolved a lot post said movement, and he's still going very strong. He's very much personality in his own right, and some people know him without having even seen his films because he's also an actor who's shown up in a multitude of films, even going into that Star Wars Mandalorian show. So he's shown his face to different audiences, so people know his face, they know his voice, and they know his personality. But in terms of filmmaking, he's very much known, especially in his earlier career with the narrative features, for like on-location shooting, allowing actors to improvise and react naturally to the situations they're put in. So he doesn't like to storyboard his films. He has a story outline. He does have a script, but he's like, hey, if it happens to be raining this day, we're still going to shoot, and you're going to have to react this way. You might be drenched as you're saying your lines. A lot of his films focus on the working class or people in a lower class status or who are struggling in some sort of way. We do see a bit of that in this film. And a lot of highlighting issues of imperialism and fascism, which we definitely see in this movie. His later career, in more modern stuff, he definitely shifted more of his focus on documentaries, but he still explored those themes through exploring like real life stories. And I think he's to some people probably known more for his documentaries, but he definitely started his career more in the scripted features. So I would say we did talk about in the intro episode about the auto run film director. He's very much of that ilk because he is a personality. I highly recommend, if you have not listened to him speak, which I'd be shocked if you're listening to this episode if you haven't heard Herzog speak, but it's a real treat. He's a great narrator and speaker.
Yeah, he is wonderful. You feel his personality through these narrative features. You definitely see them in the documentaries. He's one of his documentary style is very he'll put himself in the documentaries. You also, if you've seen the wonderful Les Blanc films that star him, Burden of Dreams about the making of Fitzcarraldo, or the delightful Werner Herzog Eats His Shoe, uh, those also feature him as just a personality and lots of him talking and sharing opinions on various things. So he's very outspoken. I get the sense a little bit with Werner Herzog that some of the verboseness and personality, it's somewhat of a constructed persona,
Mhm.
especially. So I have a quote from him, but it does feel to me to be a little bit constructed, like he's sort of doing a self-mythologizing. So
Yeah.
he says, I wasn't brought up in the system, and I am an autodidact and have never been to film school. While I was doing my studies, I worked at night in a steel mill in Munich. I made enough money to shoot my first short in 35 millimeter. I hired a cameraman, and there was the Munich Institute for Film Research, a precursor of the Munich Film School today. And these bastards had 3 cameras locked in some kind of safe, and I went and borrowed one of them. I think to this day they don't realize that one of their cameras is missing. Under these circumstances, I think it was right to appropriate the means of production. What made me a filmmaker? I made myself a filmmaker. So fully admits to just, stealing a camera from the Munich Film School, and that's actually what this was shot on, is this
Yeah.
35 millimeter camera along with several of his early films. So yeah, he's a character, I think, definitely.
Very much taking do it yourself to the next level, I'd say.
For sure, and there are tons and tons of stories about the production of this film in particular that we'll also get into, but he, I don't think it's fair to say necessarily that he is like I think he's more stretching the truth than outright
Mhm.
lying about his own persona. He is definitely playing it up and sort of hamming it up in some ways because, like we mentioned in our first episode, the Otto Ren idea played to these directors' favor internationally. If they could make themselves personalities that people liked or wanted to hear more from, then their films would do better. And that was sort of the way that international film worked then and still works to some extent today. If a director has a personality and is someone that people respond to, that critics are interested in, gives a good interview, then their films get more attention. So I think there's definitely some of that going on. But I also find him just sort of delightful, like the way he talks, and particularly like when he's talking about movies and some of his quotes about what he finds special about movies and the need for good film and good images, I think are really special. Like the way he talks about that really resonates with me.
I feel the same way. I think he's very soothing to listen to, and he's someone that just appreciates art overall, and I feel like he very much encourages people to just go out and do it and not wait for permission, which I know is a little bit more difficult now than it was obviously in the 70s when things were, I don't know, there was just more of an allowance for independent filmmakers or artists, but I think there's still room for that, and I think if you're gonna take inspiration but from a director, Herzog is definitely a great one to take inspiration from.
Yeah, and talking, in some ways it is harder, but talking about the means of production, like the bar's never been lower to
Hmm.
making films because you don't have to shoot on film necessarily. You could shoot a film on an iPhone today.
Yeah.
Uh, and it'll certainly look different than shooting it on 35 millimeter, but there are less barriers to creating something and getting your film out into the world than there were back then. And he is really on the leading edge of this, like, let's appropriate the means of production and just get it done and get these films out in the world. And my favorite quote from him, I have here, it's one of my favorite quotes about movies ever. He says, "We live in a society that has no adequate images anymore, and if we do not find adequate images and an adequate language for our civilization with which to express them, we will die out like the dinosaurs." I love that.
Wow.
He's always talking about, yeah, and he's in Burden of Dreams and Werner Herzog Eats His Shoe. He's talking about like the need for images as a way to change thought patterns, behavior patterns. And so he really sees film as a thing that can change people's minds and basically produce empathy and produce change in the world. And so he's sort of at the forefront of that in a lot of ways, I think.
Yeah. I think with that also, like, images are, you don't need language there with the use of subtitles or even dubbing if you want, because I know there's a lot with this film in particular in terms of dubbing, which I'm sure we'll get into, but images are translatable across multitude of languages. So it is something that is very important. And yeah, I also love that quote. It's a fantastic quote.
Yes. It's really wonderful. He's wonderful. This production for Aguirre, The Wrath of God was rather chaotic. It was shot on location in the Peruvian forest, which is itself insane just to do,
Yeah.
particularly at this time and with the budget and resources that this film had. So what can you tell us about this production and some of the wild and crazy stuff that happened during it?
Nothing made me happier. I mean, I do really enjoy this film a lot, but I think reading about it is even more enjoyable sometimes because I mean, I messaged you, I was like, I was cracking up just listening or reading the stories. And again, of it might be slightly exaggerated, but I had a lot of fun reading it. This is the first time Kinski and Herzog worked together. They're obviously known for their partnership throughout each other's career, but this is the first time they worked together. And oddly enough, they met years before because Kinski had rented a room in Herzog's family house, and he remembered how chaotic he was. And when he was writing this character, he thought of him because he's like, this is the only person who can play this chaotic character. He was not wrong. They fought a lot. Kinski, if you know anything about him, you know that he was a difficult human being to be around. He was always arguing with Herzog. At some point, he wanted to walk off, and Herzog had to threaten his life so that he would continue to act in the film. There was a lot of just weather changes, a lot of flooding, a lot of bad weather, and as we mentioned earlier, that they were still going to film as needed because they only had so much budget, so they could not delay and have to continue paying the cast and crew members. They shot this in English, oddly enough, because that was the only common language across all the actors. So they shot this in English and they did two dubs. They did a German dub, which I feel like is probably the one that most people have seen. They also did an English dub. One of my favorite stories. If you watch the film, you see there's a lot of monkeys towards the end of the movie. And again, who knows how accurate this is, but I'd like to think that it is accurate. Herzog pays local trappers to trap 400 monkeys, which seems beyond excessive. uh, and they decide that they probably can get more money, that they're going to sell them to an American buyer. Herzog hears this and intercepts them at the airport before they're deported off to America, pretends to be a vet, saying they need to get their vaccinations before they can leave the country, steals them back, shoots his scene, and then releases them back into the wild. When I read that, I was like, you know what? They really don't make him like this anymore. So
I know that's just so crazy that actually happened.
I know.
I read that and I was like, I need to find this somewhere else to make sure that this is actually true. But it does seem to be.
I know.
I
I saw it in
saw
a couple
in
places.
several places. Yeah, it seems that this actually happened.
So
Um,
funny.
the Kinski and Herzog relationship, you know, you hear that there's tension between an actor and a director about interpretation of the character, and particularly with this particular character. My mind immediately goes to like, oh, Kinski was probably thought of him as more sympathetic, or was trying to find like an actor's perspective into it that was more sympathetic than Herzog wanted to portray, because it is difficult to portray people who are so devious and evil as an actor and trying to find some form of truth. That's like a common dispute that would happen on a film set. That's not what happened on this film set. Kinski wanted to play him more insane and just
Hmm.
wanted to go like really, really big and hammy in the performance. And Herzog wanted something that was still as insane but more subtle. And I think that's what you see in the actual film is there's this sort of scheming, simmering deviousness to Aguirre that comes through in the film, and
Yeah.
the takes aren't so huge, but Herzog apparently would sort of needle him before a take and let him get really mad, and then he'd sort of fizzle out, and then they'd do the take when he no longer had the energy to be as crazy and insane. So yeah, it's wild that they did so many films after this, because it seems like in this film and several of the other films that they worked together on, there was a lot of tension,
Mm.
and like you mentioned, the threats of violence. I think Herzog threatened to shoot Kinski and himself if Kinski left, basically. So yeah, there's wild stories about this movie, and Herzog is not yet 30 years old when they filmed
Mm-mm.
this, and so he's very young, just
Very
going out
young.
into the rainforest. And it's amazing that this actually turned into a film, given some of how it was produced.
Like, it just sounds like an absolute nightmare, and I would be like, "I'm never working with any of you ever again," but that's the love of cinema for you.
Absolutely. I think the one other thing that I came across that you hinted at, but a lot of the events that are shown in the film are things that actually happened in real life as they were shooting. So the rafts floating off towards the
Mhm.
beginning of the film, like the river actually flooded, and the rafts that they were planning on using for the whole film floated away. And so they made that a plot point in the movie and built the building of new rafts as a new scene because they actually had to do it. So there's a lot of, and there's, I think that's part of what makes this movie so great is in this movie, and even more so in Fitzcarraldo, but this movie as well, like they actually had to do this stuff. They actually had to like lug this giant cannon around and push it through the mud, and they
Yeah.
were all as miserable as the people that they're portraying are. So the layer between fiction and reality is not so strong in this because it was such a nightmare to actually shoot and pull off. And you get that sense watching the film that they're actually going through a lot of the things that are being portrayed here.
Very much. Even just like how dirty and worn down they look. And I know they shot this in sequence, so because he was like, I need them to feel the terror of like, are we gonna make it out of this situation? And I'm not saying that they're not all good actors, they are, but there's only so much acting you can do when you're also actively living the real experience. So you can feel it. And I think that's a huge reason why this film is still talked about and is considered one of his all-time best.
Yeah, absolutely. So we should talk a little bit about the historical accuracy or perhaps lack thereof of
Uh-huh.
this story. Can you talk us through that a little bit, Felicia?
Yeah, and I'm saying this as someone who does not know that part of history at all.
Yeah.
So if I hadn't read that it wasn't accurate, I probably would just take it as face value. And I probably didn't even know that it was based on actual living characters, to be fully honest, but he's kind of melding together multiple stories, and specifically like two different expeditions, but all these characters did live and they did go on these expeditions, but Herzog is kind of taking the bare bones of it and creating his own historical fiction. So it's in quotes based on a true story, but one that he's taking a lot of liberties with. And just kind of even the fact that Kinski is blonde and blue eyed, obviously the real Aguirre was very much not that.
Yeah.
It wasn't very, Nordic looking. He was a Spanish, uh, person. And then I do think, and I do want to get into that at some point, just the use of Kinski specifically, but what Herzog does and what he does in a lot of his work is reimagine things. And I think it works. I don't think that most people watching this movie are experts on this moment in history, to be honest. And I'm sure there's people who probably watching it being like, that's not accurate, but he's never pretending to be like, this is a docufiction story.
Yeah.
I don't know how much you know about that moment, that part of history.
No, haven't studied it closely
No.
enough to be familiar with any of these characters. Just did a little bit of digging to prep here. For a film, you couldn't care less, when
Yeah.
things are based on history, based on novels, like use what works and, make up or adapt the rest to make the best film that you can make, I think. And so
Yeah.
Herzog is certainly doing that here. So it doesn't bother me that a lot of things are merged or changed. He is, I think, representing perspectives on the way that colonialism and imperialism came into these countries and interacted with the natives and interacted with the land, the foolhardiness of these sorts of voyages, the gullibility of the just taking the El Dorado thing at face value and there's this magical city of gold that we're going to find going through. So I I think he is getting to the poetic truth, even if like the historical lines are a little blurred here just to make a good film.
Yeah. And I think we'll get into it here probably next when we get into like how it fits in the genre or the movement. But it was interesting to hear him say, and maybe his thoughts have changed now, but especially when he was interviewed around the time it was released, people do view it as like a kind of retelling of what happened in Germany. and a commentary on that. At the time, he was claiming it wasn't, and that it was just his version of this part of history, but it's hard not to see the parallels of someone looking like Kinski being so kind of insane and saying, this is what we're going to do, and taking lives without any mercy. So there's a lot of parallels there that whether he wanted to admit it or not, he subconsciously wrote into the story for sure.
Yeah, I definitely felt that at times on a more metaphorical level, but at the most direct level at the very end of the film when he's talking about, I think, marrying his own daughter to create this pure race that's going to rule El Dorado and all of this stuff. So there's like this racial component that's brought into
Yeah.
it. And it's like, okay, yeah. This is definitely like a pretty direct allegory at that point. So I think there's definitely that aspect to this film. And yeah, so we can get into how the film is important to the new German cinema movement and the hallmarks that it displays and how it pushes or moves the genre forward. So, in terms of that representation of Nazism, you see the direct telling of stories related to Nazism, films about Hitler or 1940s Germany, more late in the new German cinema movement, like the late 70s, early 80s. There are a lot of those sorts of stories that get told. But what you get in the sort of early period is more metaphorical, allegorical, dealing with the thoughts and attitudes that run throughout history that led to that particular moment and that particular time in Germany. And these thoughts and attitudes have not been confined to one state for 5 years. They've been a big part of history for, generations. So I think Herzog is identifying that and telling the sort of allegorical fable as a way of reckoning with that and just sort of imperialism in general.
Yeah. And it's something that you see him touch upon a lot. And as you said, we both haven't seen the first two films, so I don't know how much he touches upon it in those two films, but definitely here and then later in his career, he's a little bit more direct about it. I don't know that he ever really made a film about Nazi Germany directly, but I think here, as you said, it's difficult not to see those themes coming through, and with those speeches, especially towards the end, you can't you can't deny what he's trying to say, even if he wants to downplay it. Probably because in 1972, it's still not something that a lot of filmmakers are wanting to talk about at the time. And I have to assume that his
Yeah.
mindset has changed since
And,
then.
yeah, filmmakers are often resistant to like giving quotes that sort of solve their movie of like, this is what the movie is, because
Yeah.
then it gets reduced to this is only what the movie is. And
Yes.
you can't give a quote that sums up a movie. And so I get that Herzog and other directors don't really want to do that layer of interpretation, would rather let the audience. And there is more to this movie than just this is about Nazism. Um, but I think it's a big part of what makes it interesting and great is that it is confronting these imperialist attitudes, and that's a big part of what new German cinema is doing in general. These are really the second generation after the Nazis, so their
Mhm.
parents often were Nazis or had some relationship to this fascist state. And we're getting to the point now where you've got a new generation who's risen up, who remembers it from early childhood or not at all, but is still having to grapple with the history of their country being something that is so horrendous, but they are a lot more, it's like less personal to them. They're a generation removed, and so they seem a lot more willing to grapple with it sort of directly. And as the movement progresses, the confrontation with Nazism becomes more direct and like, let's look at this right in its face and figure out, how to portray it and really grapple with what that meant for us as a country.
Yeah, which we definitely will explore throughout this series, and there'll be films that are more overt about it than this one is, and we'll see how other directors tackle it. But it's always interesting to see how Herzog tackles politics and history because it's just he's blunt, and he's still early in his career where he's a little bit less blunt here, but he's never shied away from stating a message, even if there's multiple messages throughout this film. So he's not just creating a story that's devoid of any real meaning, which is fine if you want to, but that's not Herzog style.
Yeah. The other interesting thing about this film, and I think it goes to something we were saying about the movement in general, about there not being a ton of huge hits, particularly in Germany at the time. There are some international hits. This was sort of neither at the time. It was more of a cult hit and
Mhm.
wasn't released in the US, for example, for 5 years after its initial release in Germany. It doesn't really play any festivals. It does get some awards. It gets nominated for a César Award in France, funny enough.
Mhm.
Gets some nominations in Germany as well. And so it's more of its reputation grows over time. And I think New German cinema in general, like you'd think of this as one of the, three most important movies of the movement. And I think I was looking at this film expecting it to be like, okay, when this film landed, it really launched new German cinema into the international consciousness in a way. This is a relatively early film. A lot of the 60s films are lesser known or seen. So maybe this was the point where this started getting taken seriously as a movement internationally. Doesn't really seem to have been the case. It just sort of grew in reputation over time more. So it's
I was
interesting.
also shocked by that too, because I know when in our intro episode we did highlight the films that did have some success, and there's a few on that list that shocked me because they're not films that are spoken about as much anymore versus something like this that is obviously a cult hit. I was shocked to find out, and I know that he himself said that he blames the lack of success on the fact that this is not a full co-production by a television station, but they did put some money into the production. And part of the deal was that they were going to air the film in full the same day it was going to be released in the cinemas. So you could either go to the cinema or you could watch it on TV. And I don't know how many people watched it on TV, but it wasn't a huge hit, definitely in the cinemas at the time. And he blames that for in his mind, that's how he's looking back on it, being like, "That's the reason why. It's because everyone stayed home to watch it." I don't know if that's the truth, but that's in his mind, he's like, he regrets the decision. But when you're early that in your career, you're gonna kinda take whatever money you can get, and as you said, in our, a little bit of history on New German cinema, a lot of films were produced with the help of television, so that's another way it fits into the movement as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk even today about how, how big is the window between theatrical and
Hmm.
streaming or television or whatever. So that people today think that that has a big effect in how well a movie does, how much it feels like an event, and particularly for a film like this, like being able to see it on a big screen, being
Yeah.
able to see those gorgeous visuals in that way could have made a difference. One of the films that was a big success in Germany of the sort of six breakthroughs was actually Herzog's next film, The Enigma of Caspar Hauser. So I wonder
Hmm.
if that was more what launched him into the public consciousness, but then its reputation, though still relatively strong, has not grown as much as Aguirre, The Wrath of God, which is probably now his best known film and best loved film at this point. So maybe that did a little bit more to launch him internationally and get him at some of these festivals and stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah, he um doesn't necessarily have a huge hit on his hands at the time with this one, but you can see how this type of movie would do really well on the midnight independent theater run and get in front of a bunch of people who are interested in interesting cult films like this, and that its reputation would grow over time. So in the 70s, there is starting to be a lot of infrastructure where, those John Waters films are popping. The Holy Mountain is another one that's like, yeah, that's a huge, cult hit, midnight movie sort of thing that grows over time and reputation. And so that sort of infrastructure can really grow things, at least here in the US. And
Hmm.
I'm assuming they have similar infrastructure internationally elsewhere too.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not surprised at all that the one region, especially of Europe, that was a fan of it was France, because
Yeah.
they love a little bit of drama. At least the bigger award that it did get was
Yeah.
over in France.
The César Awards. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. They sometimes know what they're talking about. They
Sometimes.
sometimes do. Another aspect here that is common across several new German cinema directors is the use of sort of Brechtian elements and a little bit more distance to the performance, less emotionality to it. Can you talk us through that a little bit, Felicia?
Yeah, I think with a lot of the films with the movement and what we see in this is that like you said, the distance and addressing the audience, a lot of voiceover and narration, but a lot of times we're seeing non-professionals or first-time actors, which gives a different sort of performance. And I think when you have something when you're watching where you can't tell if someone's actually acting or not, it brings forth a level of realism that we don't see necessarily in other films. And knowing that Brecht is a very well-known German author, and the way he would, break that fourth wall and challenge the audience to kind of involve themselves within the way they're interacting with the story is very interesting, because I think New German cinema, the way they wanted to approach filmmaking and storytelling was by being a lot more blunt and forcing the audience to kind of be more introspective than they might have been, especially when we're looking back on the earlier, Heimat films, where it was kind of distancing yourself from what had happened in their history, and here they're facing it head on. So it's interesting here where this film, where we do see a direct breaking of the fourth wall with Aguirre addressing the audience towards the end of the film, and he's talking directly at you. And it's always funny when you see that in a film, because you're like, wait a minute, is he looking at me, or is the
Yeah.
camera just like where it's placed, but no, he's he's talking to us, and by that point, you spent a lot of time with Aguirre, and, I mean, frankly, I was, quite scared of him, and when he's addressing you with the speech that he's giving, it's very intense and it's incredibly effective. And you know that if you didn't already know that he meant business, when you're being spoken to by Klaus Kinski head on, you're gonna listen. So it is interesting the way Herzog tackles it in this film versus other directors who might not necessarily break the fourth wall, but they do use a lot of Brechtian elements through
Yeah.
their storytelling.
Other directors we'll be covering on this series,
Yeah.
Alexander Kluge is thought of as somewhat Brechtian in his
Mhm.
approach. Jean-Marie Straub and Danielle Huile. They make films that are very minimalist in style, and the thought is, and I really respond to this style in films. I'm a huge Robert Bresson fan. He definitely has this minimalist approach and wants to use non-actors, strip out
Mhm.
emotionality in performance as a way, like you said, of drawing the audience in. When you have an actor who is portraying something, I wouldn't say absent of emotion, but definitely toned down, isn't trying to go really big and make you feel or recognize their emotion. What happens is that you actually provide the emotion in some ways.
Mhm.
Like, we're very empathetic creatures, humans, and so we can recognize something and put ourselves in the shoes of the situation, and even without the emotionality being presented to us of this is how this person feels and I'm going to act so that you know exactly how this person feels, we can imagine how that person might feel, and that actually makes me feel more deeply that situation than watching someone give great performances. Though I will say, not every movie needs to take the same approach to be great. There are movies that have huge performances, and maybe the version of this where Kinski goes huge is something that would like win Oscar awards, and maybe deservingly so, give a great performance that makes people feel deeply in that way. But it's a different approach, and that's, I think, how it works for me at least.
Yeah, and there is definitely going to be some films we'll cover where the performances are a bit bigger, or even just the mise en scène is a lot more flamboyant than you would see. Although this is not the mise en scène on this one's for sure not minimalist. He's deep in the forest, so it's not as bare bones as other films you'll see throughout the series, but the I think again, it's easier to say because this is the version we're getting, but I think it works that the performances are a little bit more on the minimal because again, if you've seen Kinski, you know that he can go all out. So it actually is refreshing to see him a little bit more calm in this one, and actually makes it more terrifying that he's a little bit more calm in this one because inside, you know, the rage is bubbling. Both the character and I'm sure the actor, the rage is bubbling inside him. So it's interesting.
Certainly. Well, we can get into the film itself at this point. We've already gotten into the film itself quite a bit in the
Yeah.
making of the film, of course, but some of the sequences of the film, some of the aspects of the film that are unique or noteworthy here. So the film is doing quite a bit in exploring thematic material. It's definitely a descent into madness movie. It's talking about delusions of grandeur. It's exploring obsession through this Kinski performance. So Yeah, I think similar to you, like it is pretty um striking and terrifying watching this performance, watching somebody who's so unhinged get into this situation, but it is so clearly doomed from the very beginning. Like, when it's clear that they're in a very bad way from the very beginning of this mission of the one raft is across the river and uh they're all killed by natives, and then the rafts float away. Like, that is not the time to be leading an uprising and
No.
changing leaders. The initial leader, Don Pedro de Ursua, has the right idea of like, this is not going well. We need to just go back and tell them that this is not happening. And Aguirre, of course, stages a revolt, and then they go deeper into the madness from there. But yeah, it's wild.
To say the very least, deeper into the madness, what I do like about this movie a lot is that it throws you right into it. Like, there's at the very, very beginning, there's a bit of historical, title scenes that we're seeing, but not enough to give you like, hey, this is the whole backstory of why these characters are there. The story kind of brings you along into it, and because of who Herzog is, he trusts and respects his audience enough to just be like, I'm gonna throw you in, and I'm gonna give you the right amount of information, and we can go from there. You don't need to see Aguirre's upbringing to understand who he is. Trust the performances and trust the storytelling, because I know the first time watching this, feeling like, okay, I need to situate myself because I don't really know this part of history. So how much am I gonna get? But then it does have such a fantastic job of just being like, yes, we're touching upon parts of that history, but it's mostly about this character and all the people he's dragging into the madness with him. That's what the story is about, and while exploring those themes. So, another filmmaker might decide, I need to give you a bit more reason why he's like this. And I think with Herzog, he's never been much for hand holding, which
Hmm.
works.
It does. The basically 2 minutes of exposition at the beginning where Pizarro is saying, okay, here's what Ursua and his wife Ines, their role is. Here's Aguirre, his daughter's going along as well, and they're okay. The monk is going to go with them. De Carvajal. We've got the Spanish nobility, de Guzman, who's going as well, and so he cues it all up, and it makes sense in the flow of the movie that he would be commissioning this expedition and telling about
Uh-huh.
all the people who are going on the expedition and why. And so it's pretty clever as a way to set up the movie, but if you do miss that 2 minutes, and I think the first time I didn't realize that like this is setting up the whole entire movie and I really need to lock into this to know what's going on. Like, if you miss that, then it's going to be a rough time trying to remember who all of these characters
Yes.
are.
And why they're there. But
Yeah.
then you can just go along for the ride and be like, well, I'm going to follow along with the chaos. Yeah, I think you can still get something out of it, but it definitely helps to listen to
Yeah.
the first 2 minutes.
Yeah, you never know when something might be essential like that. There's also so many different examples of the way colonialism is failing both the oppressors and the oppressed in this movie. And so I found it interesting how many different, like the missionary character, the monk de Carvajal, and how he kills one of the natives for heresy at like the drop of a pin. You've
Yes.
got lots of terrible representation of slavery. They have slaves along with them on these conquests. You've got basically this desire for power and to rule, and what does that mean, and the fear of the natives versus just a respect for, like, this is not our land. It's like, we're gonna conquer this land and make it ours. And then the wild search for gold, more riches, looking for the resources in these places so that they can steal the resources and control them. Like, there's so many aspects of the way that colonialism operates and thinks in this film that was like, you could do much worse for an introduction to, like, here's why colonialism is bad, than
Yeah.
this film.
I know. He kind of boils it down to, if you want to be crass about what is this movie about? It's about greed, and wanting power is greed, and doesn't matter who you're trying to overtake in power. When he gets tired of taking over, what he thinks is like, okay, I'm able to take over the natives, even though he knows he's not. I'm going to take over within my own circle because I need to be on top. And as you said, something where you mentioned during his speech where, kind of melding a full race through his daughter, it's just saying that I need to be the only person in charge. And you see how he just takes down every person above him prior to that. It's just something that you can't really escape, and these people will never be happy. They always have to overtake, and it's really sad to see the way they're treating the different slaves that they have, because they have different slaves that they're carrying with them, and they're trying to overtake, and it's very intense, the levels of power that are taking place on this very small raft that they're traveling on. This is very small space to be doing all this chaotic nonsense on.
Yeah, definitely.
They even
It's
got a horse on that they do get
mhm.
rid of, unfortunately. That was a sad scene.
Yeah,
That scene did make me cry.
the poor
Oh
horse.
gosh.
At least the horse was allowed to live, in
I
theory. Who
know.
knows how long the horse, maybe a native found it and took good care of it.
I hope.
uh The thing that sticks out to me the most about colonialism in this movie is the sort of narrowing and retreat into self. Like you mentioned, that speech at the end of, like, his daughter is the one that he's going to marry because it has to be just like the, it can only be his bloodline. It has to be this narrow band. You see that as well with the missionary and religion of, there's only one acceptable way
Mhm.
here, everything else is heresy. And so there's this retreat into self rather than an empathy and respect for others that comes across in the way that colonialism is portrayed here. It's also just really stupid. Like, a lot of the demonstration of power is like, you see it's just terrible ideas for this exposition of, like, we're going to display our power by bringing all of these cannons along, but they're in a terrible place to be
Yeah.
bringing cannons. Like, in the first 5 minutes, you see them, like, trying to push these cannons through the mud, and they've got it on their raft, and their rafts float away, and all of this stuff is just like, this is just not well thought through.
Yeah. I think he's definitely pointing out how idiotic a lot of the people in power were, and how frankly stupid, as you mentioned, their ideas are. And I know one of your points is about the humor in this film, because I think that this film does have elements of humor, because I think Herzog is quite funny just himself. Whether sometimes I don't know that he's even not purposefully being funny, but the way he goes about telling a story ends up being humorous. And I think there are moments where I did laugh along, not laughing at it, but I'm kind of laughing at, you know, when some of them are getting shot by the arrows and they're like, "Oh, I thought this would hurt a bit more." They just
Yeah.
collapse into the water. So that has to be on purpose, the humor. And I do think it brings a bit of a lightness to something that is obviously quite heavy of a story. And I don't think this is there's a lot of trauma in this, but I don't think it's as heavy as like other traumatic films are because of that lightness and the way Herzog crafts the story, because he's also making fun of these characters, and I think it's very obvious he doesn't take those people seriously.
Yeah. A couple of times where people are dying and say something sort of funny, the one that you mentioned, and then also the guy who has his head cut off while he's counting to 10 and then continues to count after his head flies across the jungle.
That's a great
So
scene.
there are some uses of humor here, and to me, I think they work. It is very like tonally jarring in some
Mhm.
ways, particularly with those. I think like the humor of pushing cannons through the mud or just watching them like make their terrible plans works well with the themes of the movie. The violence and deaths and sort of downplaying like the deaths or it I think it drives home to some extent like what I took away from it was like these people have gone basically completely insane where they're not reacting appropriately to their own deaths or to the violence that's all around them anymore. So I think there is that aspect of it here. And I think on that level it works for me, but it does feel a little bit jarring to me tonally to have like, oh, that's sort of strange and unexpected, but it is sort of funny as well. So I'll give it that.
Yeah, it is funny. It did I don't know why I completely forgot about the head being chopped off and it's still talking afterwards. That's I just had to laugh because at some
Yeah,
point you feel so like kind of stressed out watching this movie where you're like, okay, at least you gave me to me, I always find it as like a moment to breathe before you get back into the terror of what's happening. So I was a little bit grateful for the
sure.
how silly that those scenes are.
Well, Felicia, did anything stick out about this? I think the score for this is by Popol Vuh, and Florian Frick is sort of the lead of that. Did anything stick out to you about the score for this movie?
I just thought it was fantastic. I think it's a great score that you could just one listen to outside of this movie, and I think it sets the tone very well. And the way it's placed through the film, it's not overbearing, and I never feel like it's ever kind of shifting emotions or guiding emotions. It's just kind of setting the tone for what's about to happen. Kind of to me, and maybe I don't know, that's just how I read it. It kind of felt like a theme song for the movie
Yeah.
without like having the vocals or whatnot. But I think it's a great way to set up the tone of what's to happen. And it's not too overly dramatic, but I like a synth based
Hmm.
score, and I think it works very well for this. And I would be curious to hear more from this artist because I was not familiar with him at all, but I really like it.
Hmm.
How did you feel about it?
Yeah, I do think it is a big part, and this is such, I guess we haven't mentioned yet that this is very much like a mood first movie. It's setting an atmosphere and like trying to put you in a vibe basically. And the score is a huge part of how they're doing that. The It doesn't stand out too much while you're watching it unless you're paying attention to it. It isn't like drawing attention to itself, but it is contributing so much to how this movie feels. My double feature that I'll talk about later has a very different score, even though it's also set in South America. And so watching that, it especially stood out to me of like, oh, if this had been scored differently, this movie would feel entirely different than it does. But it's very just like ominous, lots of it's the Moog was the synth at the time that
Mm-hmm.
they'd use, and it's very sort of uh yeah, just sets this sort of ominous tone throughout the whole thing that I think works in its favor as very well.
No, I agree, and I love a score that's very much tone setting and only appears when it absolutely needs to, which again, I think it's most prevalent at the start and towards the end of the film just to kind of cap off the story and I don't know. It's just beautifully used for sure.
Yeah. So this starts out in somewhat of a realism mode, but as it goes on, and particularly in the last like 20 minutes of the film, really descends into this fever dream where you're questioning what's real, what's not real. The characters are going insane. You sort of feel like you're going insane as well. And it's this true descent into madness when it really gets into like you're seeing the ship in the top of the tree
Mhm.
and all of these people are being killed that you've met throughout the film and all of that stuff. How do you feel about the last stretch here?
Yeah, I mean the shot with the ship in the tree, absolutely gorgeous. I love that shot, but I especially as people are kind of being picked off one by one or in multiple, and then we're being introduced to, you know, more violent deaths, and you're left with Aguirre surrounded by multitude of little baby monkeys, or I don't know what, just a lot of monkeys, more than I've ever seen probably in any movie. And what I love about this and what really drives it home to me is the camera's fairly steady-ish through most of this. We're not seeing a lot of flourishes through the camera, except for towards the end where we're circling the raft. And it's circling it quite quickly. You know, we're being addressed by him. He is going through his speech, which is very verbally violent, and we're being circled around this raft as we see all the dead bodies that he's surrounded by, along with the monkeys, especially the monkey that he just picks up and throws willy-nilly,
Yeah.
which I did gasp at. I was like, "Sir,
Yeah.
that's a bit much. We don't need to be throwing monkeys." But I do love the use of the camera because I don't know that he's very known for having or working with cinematographers that are showy, but I think mm, these camera tricks that he's using towards the end works for the last, 20 minutes of the movie where it's really driving home that there's no point of return for this character. You don't question that, yeah, this makes sense, that this would be the ending for all of these people. It was never going to be a happy one, but it definitely takes it to the next level.
Yeah. The first time the natives attack that raft, you're feeling a little bit of fear for the people, and you're definitely in their perspective. And so you have this sort of fear of the natives. And by
Yeah.
the end, I do wish there was a little bit more, and it's just limits of what, a German director can do and the perspective. But you don't get a lot of the native perspective. You do get one slave who becomes a bit of a character who's an
Mhm.
enslaved native. And you also have the scene with the missionaries where the natives come and try to help and are killed. But you don't have the same fear of the natives by the end of the movie. It's very, you know, these characters, and it feels like their death is inevitable, and so there's not this like this the fear of, oh, these natives are going to come and kill these people that we care about is completely gone, because we don't really care about these people in the same way, and we're sort of seeing them receive the fruit of their actions through the movie. So I think it works well in that regard of like, yeah, they're encroaching on this territory and these people are just defending their territory.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, let's talk about how this film fits into Werner Herzog's broader filmography, other films that are worth watching by Herzog.
Yeah. I mean, as we mentioned at the top, this is his third narrative feature and really his third full length. And other films of note, he does we mentioned the Enigma of Caspar Hauser. He does Fitzcarraldo, which is also a huge film. And I feel like those two, along with Nosferatu, are probably his most well-known, at least today. Then you hear some people talk about Enigma of Caspar Hauser. Strozek as well has a bit of a cult following and is a fantastic one. Is one where, Herzog goes to America. But he does go on to make a lot of influential documentaries, and as I mentioned, some people know him mostly from that work. He goes on to make stuff like Grizzly Man, My Best Fiend, which is about his relationship with Kinski. Very interesting, very funny, very intense. He does, Lessons of Darkness, Encounters at the End of the World, and Caves of Forgotten Dreams. Amongst many films, he is not stopping anytime soon. I know he has another feature, narrative feature coming out. I think he's filmed it already, as far as I know, and it might be coming out later this year or next year. So he's not stopping. I don't know that Herzog will ever retire. He probably will just, you know, as dark as it sounds, die on set. Like he's someone who will always continue working and loves to work, and it just makes he's very much keeping up with the times as well, and he's not stuck in the era that he became popular, like the new German cinema. So
Mhm.
it's fantastic to see how much his career has progressed, and again, probably why he's to this day the most well-known director in the movement, because he's just been like voraciously creating art. Versus, I mean, a lot of them are no longer with us, so that's different, but he's kept up with times and is just always releasing stuff and has written a lot of books also. So there's a lot of media on
Mm.
him, and he's always willing to give a lot of interviews. So as you mentioned, he's someone who's just fantastic to listen to. So he is someone who's willing to engage with a younger audience, which others might not be. I don't know that the only other one I can think of who's actively working would be vendors, and I don't know that he's as willing to engage with the youth like Herzog is.
Yeah, maybe not quite so much. Um, yeah, that's a good sort of overview of what he does, has been more in documentaries. He did make a fiction film called Bad Lieutenant, Port of Call, New
Mhm.
Orleans in 2009 that some people really like. I think it's pretty good, but not on the same level as some of his early stuff.
Yeah.
I really like those Bruno-esque collaborations. So the Enigma and Caspar Hauser and Strozak are my favorite of his films. I think they're absolutely stunning. But he's got some other stuff. I watched a handful of other in the New German Cinema era to prepare for this. I watched Wojciech, which is another Klaus Kinski, but very different type of performance than Kinski usually gives, where he's being more of like a vulnerable victim versus a like mad illusions of grandeur conqueror type of character. I also watched Heart of Glass, which I liked better. And that one is, it's set in the Bavarian mountains, and this glass blowing works. Basically, they lose, the foreman dies who knows the secret for blowing the special ruby glass that the town is like, their whole economy is built on selling this ruby glass, and so they're trying to figure out how to make it, but there's a lot of infighting, and he actually put the whole cast under hypnosis before they would do each take. So again, very like Herzog craziness, and you could like, it is very like dreamlike and strange performances in that movie. So it's a weird one, but I thought it was pretty interesting and compelling. So that's a deeper cut from the New German Cinema era. But if you like Aguirre, you're probably going to like Fitzcarraldo. It's very similar in what it's trying to accomplish, and the feat of the creation of the movie being the text of the movie as well, in sort of the same way. And then I just really love Grizzly Man as well. So of his later stuff, that's probably the favorite.
Yeah. I think Grizzly Man is probably the first film of his I saw, because I saw that in school. So that was my introduction to him. So and when you watch something like Grizzly Man, he's very much involved in the film as well. So you're very familiar with who he is. And I do think that, I mean, obviously for us, we're definitely trying to push the New German Cinema films and definitely check out his work here. And I think that if you want to fully understand who he is as well, that's also a good spot to start Grizzly Man. You can't go wrong with that movie. It's just fantastic.
It's really good. Yeah. So, and he's, you know, if you are making a documentary and you put yourself as a character within the documentary, you got to sort of bring the goods. I've seen that done poorly so many times, but with Herzog and Varda, they're allowed to do it as much as they want. They're the two that like, just give me as much of your personality as you want, because that's sort of where the direction that they're taking the movie. There are other documentarians that I feel like do a good job of that as well, but you have to have that particular style. It can be more of a crutch for some documentarians where they don't feel confident enough in their filmmaking that they feel like they need to like go in front of the camera and explain or add this narration or pieces, where it's just like, no, you have all of the tools that you need. But this is very a stylistic choice to bring personality to a very personal work of art that works really well for them.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up Varda, because I fully agree. I think they're the two who do it best. There's others who do it well, but they are the two that are the masters at it. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right, Felicia, what are your final thoughts on Aguirre, The Wrath of God, before we wrap it up and talk about some double features?
I think if you're going to start with Herzog, especially with the features, I think this is probably the best place to start, because you are kind of thrown into all the themes that he likes to explore, but also just what he likes to do visually. And you're gonna have the best time just reading about the production of this film. And really, like, the very final thoughts is that they just don't make movies like this anymore. And a lot of directors won't take those type of risks with putting actors in those situations or working in natural conditions or even just engaging the help of locals or maybe doing some illegal activities. And there's good reasons for all those, for not wanting to do those, but it's always interesting to see what people were willing to do back then. And I know things, it's a lot more, you're going to be dealing with a lot more lawyers if you do that now, but it's cool that we did have an era of cinema where people were just like, we're gonna go out and do this, and I don't care if I get arrested, which Herzog has been arrested multiple times
Yeah.
in his career, his life.
In Burden of Dreams, I remember he says, like, if, he's trying to get financing as, like, this is like breathing to me. If I don't get financing for this film, I will die, basically. It's like he feels so passionately about his work. And so we're lucky to have these films and, uh, these great images that he's provided us with so that we don't die out like the dinosaurs. So thank you,
There
Herzog,
you go.
for your incredible art. Okay, we've got some double features prepared. The way we're doing our double features, so we'll pick a double feature. If we were to like screen this film, what would we screen along with it? We've got a couple of extra rules. Well, really the only extra rule is that it can't be from the movement that we're covering, as a way to keep things a little interesting and talk about more
Uh-huh.
of a variety of films in our double features. I might try to put a couple extra restrictions on myself, where
Okay.
I don't think I want to pick anything from the same country, maybe not even from the same continent. Maybe not
Oh.
that far. That might be sort of tough. But maybe nothing from the same country, and then also nothing from the same decade. So go a little further, either forward or backward from the movie that we're covering. So
That's interesting. I could do that.
yeah. I'll try and we'll see how far I get. If I think of a really good double feature, I might break my rules. But for this one, I chose a movie called Zama. That's from 2017. So in the past 10 years, it was released. This is a film from Lucretia Martel. It was sort of a return after a long break. She is an Argentinian director who makes great, beautiful visual films. This film in particular is a good double feature here because it also deals with colonialism. It's about 200 years later in the era that it's covering. So things are a lot more developed in terms of the integration of the basically Spanish crown with the locals. There's more infrastructure built up, but you're following this officer, Zama, who is a colonial official, but very much like a middle manager. He's been applying and applying for this transfer to a bigger city so he can be with his wife and child, and keeps getting denied, but also like oppresses the people around him. And so it's much different from the like insane aggressiveness that we see in Kinski's portrayal in Aguirre, The Wrath of God, but forms an interesting contrast. And I like that, I wanted to find something because they like flew in from Germany to make this movie in South America. I wanted to find a South American movie that is sort of set in some of the same locations, but covers some of the same things from a South American perspective. So that's a great one, and I definitely recommend it.
No, that's I had not heard of that film. I know that director, and I've seen only one of hers because she did The Headless Woman,
Yes,
right? Yes, so I've
that's
seen
one of
that
hers.
one. I this one sounds very interesting, so I'm gonna add it to the watch list for sure. And I think it's always fun to go more modern with a double bill and just see uh how things are tackled in more modern times or by a more modern director. I, when I was watching it, thought of a film I watched a few years ago for the first time called The Last Island. On Criterion, they had a few Marlene Goris films, and I'd never heard of this director, and I watched two other films of hers and kind of fell in love with her style. She's a Dutch filmmaker, and The Last Island is a little bit more commercial, and it's not necessarily my favorite of the three that I saw, but it reminded me, the themes that she tackles in it reminded me a lot of this. So it's essentially, it's 5 men and 2 women and a dog are survivors from a plane crash. They're the only ones who survived, and they're on a desert island, which is a story that's been told many times, but it's the way each character kind of embodies a theme or a style of conflict with one another. And so there's racial dynamics, there's gender dynamics, there is the level of imperialism that's being put upon. There's one character who is like, well, we need to build a new society, we need to use the women for this, we need to build have a religion back this. So it's interesting to see how they survive those conflicts in a situation where this is 1990s, so it feels a little bit closer to us, a little bit closer to us than Aguirre Wrath of God, obviously, where we can imagine ourselves in this type of situation, but how people end up ultimately being reduced to, this is their fight or flight, moments of this is how I'm going to tackle a situation where I'm like, I don't know how long I'm going to be here. And when you realize we're probably not leaving, how you deal with that and how you deal with one another. So I think it's interesting to see being stuck in a situation that you are not sure if you're going to get out of, which is kind of what they're dealing with in Aguirre, where they're on a mission, but realistically, what we see for a lot of them, they do not make it out of the mission alive. So that's an interesting one. And I personally just want to recommend her other work. She's a great feminist director, and one that I wish more people knew about. And I really wish she had more work under her belt, but funding was always an issue for her. So, but yeah, I'd recommend those. 1990, a little bit more modern than I usually would give a recommendation for.
Well, I haven't seen that one, so I'll have to go check it out and check out more from the director. What other films of hers have you seen?
The other two that I watched were A Question of Silence and Broken Mirrors. And Broken Mirrors blew my mind. That one it's dark, but it was very interesting, and it just happens to be one that it was leaving Criterion and the description sounded interesting, and I was like, I'll put it on. And I'm so glad that I did, because it was fantastic. Not that easy to find, unfortunately, but sure some Russian website probably has it.
Yes. Those Russian websites, we love them. I've watched so many films because they're leaving Criterion. They do that little scrolling thing, and so yeah, every month it's 3 to 5 films that are leaving Criterion. I'll add to the watch list and try to get to them before they're gone, because they're always rotating stuff in and out. So that's always good to do. Cool. Well, this has been Cinema Field Guide. You can find our podcasts wherever you normally get podcasts. I'm assuming that you're an adult and know how to find stuff. If you're listening to us here, there's probably a way to find more of us on the platform that you are listening to us. So go find that and subscribe for more episodes. Yeah, give us a follow. We're also findable, Cinema Field Guide, pretty much everywhere, website, social media. So check us out there. And yeah, I think that's about it. Anything else?
No, I know it's still early in the series, but hey, if you're enjoying it, send us an email too. We'd love to hear it. We'd love to hear if you, especially as we progress, if you're feeling inspired by checking out more from the movement or what you knew beforehand, and maybe what's your favorite Herzog film. Just email us
Yeah.
about anything.
We'd
We'll read it. We'll
love
have a fun
we'd
time with
love
it.
to hear. That is cinemafieldguide@gmail.com for emails, and we will you might get your email read on an episode, and we'll talk about it. So
There you go.
or you can request that we not do that if you're shy. So that's fine too. Well, this has been Cinema Field Guide, and we will be back next week with another movie. We'll be announcing that on our social media channels, so definitely follow along so that you know what to watch in advance. It's going to be a lesser seen one. We'll say that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But one of the earlier films in New German cinema, but nonetheless very important to the movement. So, all right. Thanks all. Have a great week.
Thanks.